They said Dante Marchetti hadn't smiled in 6 years. Not once. Not for the senator's daughter his father tried to pair him with. Not for the actress who flew in from Los Angeles just to sit across from him at dinner. Not for anyone. I wasn't trying to be anyone. I was just the woman hired to get his daughter to eat her vegetables and fall asleep before 9. But 3 weeks into the job, on a night the power went out over half of Chicago's north side, I sang an old lullaby in the dark to a little girl who couldn't stop shaking, and I looked up to find him standing in the doorway, watching me, with the corner of his mouth doing something I'd been told was structurally impossible. That was the night everything started. And it was the night I found out that in that house, being noticed by Dante Marchetti wasn't a blessing. It was a target painted on your back. Hi, I'm Nora. If this is your first time here, welcome to the family. Book 1 is free, and I promise this one gets under your skin. Chapter 1. The House That Ate Light. The Marchetti estate sat behind a stone wall on the edge of Lake Forest, the kind of wall that wasn't decorative so much as it was a statement. Don't. I stood at the intercom for a full 30 seconds before I found the courage to press it, my resume folder damp at the corners from my own palms. Nora Callahan, I said. I'm here about the nanny position. No response came through the speaker. The gate simply groaned and swung inward, like the house had already made a decision about me before I'd said a word worth deciding on. I was 28. I'd spent 4 years bouncing between 2 other nanny jobs and a stretch waiting tables that I didn't put on the resume, because rich families didn't like hiring anyone who'd ever needed tips to make rent. My mother had been gone 11 years. My father I barely remembered. A quiet man who worked nights and died in a car accident when I was 6, leaving behind nothing but a photograph and a last name that meant nothing to anyone, least of all me. I'd looked up Marchetti on my phone on the train ride over. I'd gotten 3 paragraphs into a news article with the word indicted in the second sentence before I closed it and told myself the job was the job. People needed their children looked after regardless of what their fathers did for a living. That was the story I told myself walking up that gravel drive, past a fountain that wasn't running and hedges trimmed with a precision that felt almost aggressive. The house itself looked like it was built to keep things out, or in. Stone the color of old bone, windows tall and dark even at 2 in the afternoon. Ivy allowed to grow only where someone had clearly decided ivy was permitted to grow. A man in a charcoal suit opened the door before I reached it. He didn't introduce himself. He just looked at me the way you'd look at a delivery that might be the wrong size. ID, he said. I handed it over. He studied my face, then the photo, then my face again, in a way that made me feel like he was checking for something specific and not finding it. He handed it back without comment and stepped aside. Mrs. Alvarez is upstairs. Second door on the left. The entry hall was marble the color of weak tea, veined with gray, and cold enough that I could feel it through my shoes. There was a portrait wall going up the staircase. Men in old suits, all of them with the same heavy brow, the same unimpressed mouth, generations of Marchettis who had apparently never found a single thing in life worth smiling about. I climbed past all of them trying to walk quietly, though the house seemed to record every sound anyway, the way empty churches do. Mrs. Alvarez was a compact woman with silver hair pinned back so tightly it looked like it hurt, and eyes that softened only slightly when she saw me. "You're younger than they told me," she said. 28, I said. Younger, not young. That earned me something close to a smile. Bianca is 5. She doesn't like loud voices. She doesn't like the dark. She sleeps with a stuffed fox named Ember. And if Ember goes missing, this house does not function. Understood. Understood. She pushed open a door at the end of the hall, and the room behind it was the only warm-colored thing I'd seen since the gate. Yellow walls, a canopy bed. A little girl sitting cross-legged on a rug with a threadbare orange fox pressed to her chest. Her dark hair loose around a face that was far too serious for someone that small. "Bianca," Mrs. Alvarez said. "This is Nora." The girl looked at me with an expression I'd later learn was permanent. Evaluating, cautious, older than her years, and said nothing. "Hi, Bianca," I said, lowering myself to the rug without being invited. "That's a good fox." "His name is Ember," she said, like I'd already gotten something wrong and she was correcting me. "Ember," I repeated. Can I sit here? Small nod. Sep. We didn't talk for a long minute, and I let the silence be what it was, because I'd learned a long time ago, bouncing through foster placements before my aunt finally took me in, that a quiet child doesn't need conversation. She needs someone willing to stay quiet with her. It was in that stillness that I saw him. Through the open door, down the hallway, past a wide interior balcony that looked out over the marble stairs, a man stood with one hand braced on the railing, dressed entirely in black, not moving. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at nothing, at some fixed point on the wall across from him, and even so, I felt every hair on my arms rise, because there was something about his stillness that didn't read as calm. It read as contained. Dante Marchetti didn't glance toward the room. He registered. I could see it happen, a half-second recalibration. Someone is in my daughter's room. And then he turned and disappeared down a side hall, and the house exhaled. Is that your dad? I asked quietly. Bianca nodded, still stroking the fox's one good ear. He doesn't smile, she said matter-of-fact, the way another kid might tell you the sky is blue. Nobody makes him smile. Grandpa says it's not possible anymore. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing and filed it away the way you file away a warning label. That night I took the L3 stops past my apartment just so I could sit at Maddie's bar and let the noise of it drown out my own thoughts. Maddie Flores had been my best friend since we were 19 and broke together, and she took one look at my face and set a glass of wine in front of me before I'd even climbed onto the stool. You're alive, she said. Barely believable, given who signs your checks now. It's a nanny job, Mads. It's a nanny job for the Marchetti family. Nora. That's not a rich people with boats family. That's a rich people with lawyers on retainer for federal charges family. The little girl is sweet, I said. Quiet. Sleeps with a stuffed fox. The housekeeper is terrifying in a way I respect. And him. I turned my glass slowly. Saw him for 4 seconds from across a balcony. And nothing. He didn't even look at me. Maddie studied me the way she did when she thought I was hiding something, even when I wasn't yet sure I was. Promise me something, she said. If that man ever looks at you twice, you call me before you do anything stupid. I laughed and it came out easier than I expected. He's not going to look at me once, Mads. I'm the help. People like that don't see people like us. I believed that, walking home that night, my heels in my hand, the cold Chicago pavement biting through my stockings. I believed it right up until I reached my building and my doorman, Stan, held out an envelope with no return address and my first name written across the front in handwriting too neat, too deliberate, to belong to anyone who wasn't used to giving orders. Young guy in a suit dropped it off, Stan said. Wouldn't say who sent it. I carried it up 3 flights, locked the door behind me, and sat on my kitchen counter before I opened it. Inside was a single cream card, one line in black ink. We see you at that house, Nora. Watch the girl closely. Watch yourself closer. No signature. No explanation. I sat there a long time with my heart going too fast, trying to remember the exact moment that day I'd said my name out loud where someone outside those gates could have heard it. Someone already knew who I was. And I hadn't even finished my first day. By the end of the first week, I'd learned the architecture of the house the way you learn the architecture of a fear. Which stairs creaked, which hallway stayed cold no matter the season, which door led to the kitchen and which merely looked like it did. I'd learned that Mrs. Alvarez took her coffee black and her mornings silent, and that if you tried to make conversation before she'd finished her first cup, she simply wouldn't answer, as though you hadn't spoken at all. The card stayed folded inside a paperback in my nightstand drawer. I didn't tell Maddie. I told myself it was a mistake, a note meant for someone else, delivered to the wrong door by a courier too lazy to double-check. I told myself a lot of things that week that I didn't believe even as I was thinking them, because believing the alternative meant admitting I'd walked into something with teeth. Bianca warmed to me faster than I expected. By day 4 she was taking my hand without prompting on the walk between her room and the small private garden out back, where a swing hung from an oak tree old enough to have watched 3 generations of Marchettis grow up beneath it. She talked constantly to Ember, narrating a whole secret life for the fox that involved underwater kingdoms and a queen who never yelled. She didn't talk about her mother. Not once that whole first week. I noticed the absence the way you notice a missing tooth. Not because of what's there, but because of the shape of what isn't. I saw Dante Marchetti twice that week, both times in passing, both times from a distance that felt engineered. Once crossing the lower hall with two men in step behind him, none of them speaking. His stride the kind that didn't need to hurry to make its point. Once through the library window, sitting alone at a chessboard with no opponent, moving pieces against himself with the flat concentration of a man solving something that had nothing to do with chess. I met his head of security, Matteo, before I learned his name. It happened at the kitchen doorway on a Wednesday morning. I came around the corner with a tray of orange juice and toast, and walked directly into a wall of a man who caught the glass out of the air before it hit the floor, without so much as blinking. "Sorry," I said. He set the glass back on the tray, unbothered, like the reflex had cost him nothing. "Matteo," he said. One word, entire introduction. "Nora." "I know." And he was gone before I could say anything else, leaving me with the distinct impression that I'd been measured, filed, and forgotten in under 10 seconds. The real encounter, the first one that counted, happened on a Thursday evening in the long gallery hallway that connected the east wing to the main stairs, the one lined with a single dark painting of a ship in rough water that no one had ever explained to me. I was coming from the garden, dirt still under 2 of my fingernails from helping Bianca replant a fern that had outgrown its pot, and he was coming from the other direction, reading something from a folder without looking up. 3 steps between us. He lifted his head. We both stopped, not because either of us decided to, but because something in the hallway itself seemed to insist on it. Up close, he was not what the photographs online had suggested. Taller, yes, and the shoulders that came from carrying something heavy for a long time, exactly as expected. But his eyes were a lighter brown than I'd pictured, closer to amber in the low evening light, and there was a small white scar through one eyebrow that no photograph had ever caught. He looked at me the way you'd look at an equation you hadn't been asked to solve, deciding in real time whether solving it was worth the effort. "Callahan," he said. Not a question. Confirmation, the way you'd read a name off a manifest. "Yes, sir." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite amusement, not quite anything. "How is my daughter?" Also not a question. A man who had never needed to phrase anything as a request in his life. "Good," I said. "She's eating better. We planted a fern today. She named it Gerald." Was Gerald. Her choice, not mine. His eyes dropped briefly to the dirt still under my nails, then came back up without comment. He gave the smallest possible nod and stepped past me, close enough that I caught something like cedar and rain, and then he was gone down the hallway, and I stood there longer than I wanted to admit, aware that my heart was doing something it had no business doing over a 4-second conversation about a fern. That was fear, I told myself, walking to my room. Ordinary fear. The kind you feel around anyone who could, with a word, end your employment or your safety or possibly your life. I had known real fear before. I knew exactly what it felt like, had known it since I was 9 years old, and a social worker knelt down to my height to tell me, gently, that my mother wasn't coming to pick me up that day, or any day after. This wasn't that. This was something with a different shape entirely, and I refused that night to give it a name. Failed to sleep. Around 1 in the morning I gave up, pulled on a robe and went down the back stairs, skipping the 3rd step which groaned, headed for the kitchen and a glass of warm milk, the same ritual my mother used to do for me on nights I couldn't settle. The kitchen was dark except for the low light under the cabinets, and I almost dropped the saucepan when I realized he was already there, sitting at the far end of the table with his jacket off and a glass of something amber in front of him. In the one corner of the room the light didn't quite reach. "Can't sleep," he said. Not a question again. Everything from this man arrived pre-decided. "You scared me. You walk barefoot through a house that isn't yours." "Socks," I said, glancing down. "Technically." Something moved at the edge of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, a rehearsal of a smile that hadn't been performed in a long time and had forgotten some of the choreography. I turned to the stove so I wouldn't stare at it too openly, and poured milk into the saucepan. And for half a minute the only sound in the room was the low hiss of the burner and the occasional turn of ice in his glass. "She likes you," he said out of nowhere. "Bianca." I turned, spoon still in hand. "I like her too. She hasn't named anything in over a year." He turned the glass slowly between two fingers, and the low light caught a ring on his right hand. Heavy, old, a design worn soft at the edges from years of being touched exactly like that, absently, in moments just like this one. Not a stuffed animal. Not a plant. Nothing. Then you show up, and she names a fern. I didn't know what to do with the weight of that sentence, so I focused on the milk, stirring it slower than it needed. "Mr. Marchetti." "Dante." I looked up. He was watching me directly now. No folder, no distance. None of the formality that lived in every hallway of that house during daylight hours. "Dante," I said, and the word came out lower than I meant it to. "I'll take good care of her." His eyes held mine a beat longer than a normal exchange required. Not a threat, not quite an invitation either. Something more like a man quietly filing away a piece of information he intended to return to later, when he had more time to examine it properly. "I know," he said finally. He finished the drink in one motion, stood, and set the glass in the sink beside my saucepan. An oddly domestic gesture from a man who otherwise moved like every action had been budgeted in advance. When he passed behind me, his sleeve brushed my arm, and I caught the cedar again, and beneath it something like gun oil and cold night air, and beneath that, something that just smelled like a man who hadn't been touched gently in longer than he'd admit. "Good night, Callahan." "Good night." He left. I stood alone with warm milk going lukewarm in my hands, and the unmistakable, unwelcome sensation of something in my chest shifting loose from wherever it had been wedged for the last several years. On my way back up, avoiding the third step again, I heard voices from behind a half-open door near the office. Matteo's low and clipped, Dante's answering in single words, the tone of two men deciding something that couldn't wait for morning. I didn't catch the words. I caught the temperature of it, and it chilled me enough to hurry the rest of the way to my room and lock the door before I let myself think too hard about what "the girl needs more coverage starting tomorrow" might mean, coming from a man like that at 1 in the morning about a 5-year-old who just started naming ferns. The storm rolled in off the lake on a Tuesday with none of the manners of the smaller rains before it. No gradual build, just a wall of water that hit the windows sideways within an hour of the sky going the color of a bruise. Bianca was folding Ember's tiny felt blanket on the nursery rug when the first crack of thunder came close enough to rattle the window glass, and she looked up at me with the particular gravity of a child who has decided, somewhere along the way, that she is responsible for keeping bad things from happening. "Is the house going to fall?" "This house has stood through worse than one bad Tuesday," I said, and knelt to bring myself level with her. "I promise." She almost smiled. I'd learned in 3 weeks that an almost smile from Bianca Marchetti was worth more than a full one from most other children, because she rationed them the way her father apparently rationed everything else in that house. Expression, warmth, trust. I got her into bed with the lamp on and the thick quilt pulled to her chin. Her hair smelling of the same lavender soap Mrs. Alvarez bought in bulk from somewhere that clearly didn't believe in half measures. Another crack of thunder, closer, and she buried her face against my side. Fingers twisted into the sleeve of my sweater. "Sing the one from before," she said, muffled. "Not the animal one. The other one." I knew the one she meant. It was the only song I really sang. The one my mother used to hum over me when the trailer got cold and the wind came through the seams around the windows. Half real lyrics and half words she'd invented herself, about a lighthouse and a boat that always, eventually, found its way home. I'd sung it once during Bianca's bath 2 weeks earlier without thinking, and she'd tucked it away like a coin she meant to spend later. I sang it low, my hand resting against the back of her neck, and the storm outside slowly reorganized itself from threat to backdrop. She went heavy in my arms the way children do when sleep finally wins the argument they didn't know they were having. I didn't see the door move until the lightning caught it, a sliver of hallway light widening for half a second, a shape in the gap. Broad shoulders. A hand braced against the frame like a man who needed the support to keep standing there at all. I didn't stop singing. Something about the stillness of him told me that stopping would be worse, would announce that I'd seen him, would send him retreating the way he'd retreated from every doorway all week. So I kept going quieter, until Bianca's breathing dropped into the long, even rhythm of a child fully asleep, and by the time the next thunderclap rolled through, the hallway was empty again. I sat on the edge of the bed a long time after, listening to the rain, thinking about a man who apparently could not let himself be seen standing still in a doorway, listening to a lullaby meant for someone else's child. I turned off the lamp and eased the door shut behind me with the care of someone closing a church door mid-service, and the hallway smelled unmistakably of rain-soaked wool and something like whiskey that hadn't quite been finished. I knew exactly who'd left both behind. I went down the back stairs with a strange sensation that the whole house had somehow heard me sing, which wasn't true. The halls were too long, the rooms too far apart. His men occupied with the storm and the flooding along the garden wall, but the feeling followed me all the way under my own blankets, and I slept badly, dreaming of a shoulder braced against a doorframe and a hand I hadn't actually seen clench into a fist. The morning after broke clean and washed, the way Chicago sometimes does after a hard storm, like the whole city had been rinsed and set out to dry. Mrs. Alvarez appeared in the kitchen with the garden key already in hand, and her verdict already decided. Take the girl out. She needs sun or she'll turn into a mushroom. Bianca didn't need convincing. She grabbed Ember by his good ear, jammed her feet into yellow rain boots without letting me tie them properly, and towed me toward the door like I was the one who needed supervising. Mateo was waiting at the front steps before we'd even reached them. Black jacket, hands visible and loose at his sides in that particular way I'd noticed he always kept them. Ready without looking ready. Car, he said. It's 4 blocks, Mateo. Car, he said again, and it was, I realized, the longest argument I was going to win that morning, which was not at all. We took the SUV with its windows a shade too dark to be strictly legal, Bianca narrating the entire ride to Ember about how thunder was just clouds clearing their throats, which struck me as considerably more comforting than anything I might have come up with. The park had a fountain that hadn't run in years and a swing set with chains that needed oil, but Bianca made straight for it anyway, and I settled onto a damp bench with the sun finally warm enough on my face to make me forget, for a minute, about doorways and storms and cream-colored cards with no return address. That's when I noticed the man across the park. He was leaning against a sycamore in a jacket too light for the wind. No dog, no newspaper, nothing to explain his stillness except the fact that his eyes weren't moving over the park the way eyes normally do. They were fixed. Not on me. On the swings. And Bianca. I felt the temperature of my own blood change. I didn't turn my head fully, some instinct told me not to, but I found Mateo without moving more than my eyes, and he was already standing, already positioned exactly between the man and the swing set, the distance between us collapsing from 10 feet to 3 without me having registered him cross it. Nora, Bianca called from the swing. Push me. Coming, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt, which I counted as a small private victory. I pushed the swing twice, 3 times, glancing sideways at the sycamore each time. By the third push the man was gone. Only a cigarette, unlit, abandoned on the wet grass where he'd been standing. Mateo appeared at my shoulder without a sound. Time to go back. 5 more minutes, Bianca tried. 2, I said. It was 1, Mateo said, and this time I didn't argue. We went home in the car, not on foot, and Mateo held the door for Bianca and looked at me half a second longer than the moment required, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. Dante was in the kitchen when I came down after settling Bianca with warm milk and a change of dry socks. Sleeves rolled, no jacket, a detail so small it shouldn't have registered, and yet in a house built entirely of controlled surfaces, a man without his jacket felt like a confession. 2 cups sat on the counter beside him. Not one. Sit, he said, and it wasn't a request exactly, but it wasn't quite a command either. It was the particular in-between register he seemed to reserve only for me. Sep. He slid one of the cups toward me. How was the park? He asked, though from the flatness of it, I understood immediately that he already knew more than he was letting on. Good. She ran a lot. Mateo told me there was a man. I looked up. Who was he? We're finding out. His eyes were a different color in the kitchen's afternoon light. Less amber, more gold, the scar through his eyebrow catching a thin white line of sun. Next time you don't walk. Even 4 blocks. Understood. He was quiet a moment, turning his cup slowly, the ring on his hand catching light the way it had that first night. Then, without looking at me, "You sing well." I felt my whole chest go still. "You heard that." "I heard that." Pause longer this time. "For her." I didn't correct him because I wasn't sure in that moment that the correction would have been entirely honest. "My mother used to sing it to me," I said instead, looking at the steam rising off my cup rather than at him, because I understood, instinctively, the way you understand not to look directly at something too bright, that if I lifted my eyes right then, he'd see everything I hadn't yet decided how to name. Was she the one who taught Bianca to trust strangers that fast? Bianca doesn't trust strangers. She decided very deliberately that I wasn't one. Something almost like a laugh moved through him. More breath than sound, but real, the first one I'd heard from him in 3 weeks in that house. He finished his coffee, stood, and at the doorway without turning around said, "Thank you for the song." And then he was gone, leaving behind the smell of coffee and cedar and something I still didn't have a word for, hanging in the kitchen long enough that I found myself, absurdly, not wanting it to fade. The rest of that week became an exercise in almost. I almost ran into him in the garden, where he'd taken to standing at the edge of the veranda with a glass of water he never drank, watching Bianca and me from a distance he clearly thought was greater than it was. I almost caught him watching from the library doorway when I passed with an armful of towels. Bianca noticed before I let myself admit it out loud. "Daddy's laughing," she told me one morning, syrup dripping off her fork, paused mid-air like the sentence needed the drama. "On the inside. I can tell." I wanted to ask a 5-year-old how she'd learned to read a man that carefully, and then I remembered whose daughter she was, and didn't ask at all. Saturday brought rain again, thinner this time, a gray drizzle that never quite committed to being a storm. Bianca went down early after a bath and 3 readings of the same book about a fox who learns to fly, and I went to the kitchen for tea and found Mrs. Alvarez holding out a tray with a coffee pot that had gone cold an hour earlier. "He asked for this and never came for it," she said, pushing it at me with the delicacy of someone shoving a boulder downhill. "Take it to him." "It's cold, Mrs. Alvarez." "Then it's still cold in your hands as it is in mine. Have a bad knee." "You have 2 good ones." I carried the tray down the east hall, the sconces dimmed to that low amber setting that illuminated nothing and concealed nothing either, and found the office door cracked open, yellow lamplight spilling into the hall in a way that felt less like an accident and more like an invitation someone hadn't quite worked up the nerve to extend properly. I knocked. "Come in," came the answer, tired in a way I hadn't heard from him before. He wasn't at the desk. He was on the low leather sofa against the wall, sleeves rolled, tie gone entirely, a photograph held in both hands like something that might shatter if he set it down. I recognized the woman in it before anyone told me who she was. Dark hair, a soft laugh caught mid-motion, the kind of photograph where you can tell the person taking it said something funny right before the shutter clicked. There were more scattered across the low table. A whole private archive laid bare. "I brought the coffee," I said. "I'll go. Sit." I set the tray down and, against every instinct the boarding house rules of employment had ever taught me, sat at the far end of the sofa, putting as much distance between us as the cushions allowed. It didn't matter. I could feel the warmth off his shoulder anyway. He was quiet a long time before he set the photograph face down on the table, slow and careful, the way you'd set down something you weren't ready to stop holding but couldn't hold anymore either. 4 years, he said. I was in Milan when it happened. An aneurysm. No warning. I got the call in a meeting I didn't need to be in, and by the time I landed, it was already over. He rubbed at the base of his thumb, a small, distracted motion. I've replayed every version of that week where I don't get on that plane to Milan in the first place. None of them end differently. I still wasn't here. You couldn't have known. I should have found a way to know. He looked at me then, and his eyes were red-rimmed. Not from crying, I understood, but from the particular exhaustion of a man who hadn't let himself sleep properly in longer than 4 years. Why do you sing that song to her? Because my mother sang it to me. And your mother? Gone since I was 17. My father before that. I don't really remember him. I grew up mostly with my aunt, and when that didn't work out, I grew up mostly on my own. I looked down at my hands, laced together in my lap, the gesture I made whenever I didn't know where else to put the weight of what I was saying. I understand quiet houses better than most people would like. He didn't say anything for a while. The office held a different silence than the rest of the house. Closer, denser, thick with old paper and rain tapping steadily against the window glass behind us. Then his hand moved toward mine, slow, the caution of someone approaching something that might startle and run, and closed over it. Warm. Heavier than I expected, but careful with that weight in a way that told me exactly how much strength he was choosing not to use. You're the only thing in this house that's made sense in 4 years, he said low, like the sentence cost him something to hand over. Dante. It was the first time I'd said his name to his face without permission being asked or granted first, and I didn't take it back. He turned toward me. There hadn't seemed to be much space between us to begin with, and somehow there was even less now, without either of us visibly moving to close it. I could smell the coffee gone cold on his breath, the rain on his shirt, cedar beneath both. His hand came up from mine to my jaw, slow enough that I could have pulled back at any point, and I didn't. The kiss, when it came, was careful, not tentative exactly, but deliberate, the kind of careful that belongs to someone who knows exactly how much damage he's capable of and is choosing, in this one specific moment, not to use any of it. His other hand slid to the back of my neck, fingers threading into my hair, and I felt it, just once, tremble. When he finally pulled back, he kept his forehead against mine, breathing unsteady, eyes closed like he was postponing the return to the rest of the world for as long as it could be postponed. I shouldn't have done that, he said. Don't, I said. Don't apologize for that. Something that was almost a laugh moved through his chest, more air than sound, the same one Bianca had sworn existed all along. I realized, sitting there in the lamplight with his wife's photograph face down on the table between us and the rain going soft against the glass, that I'd been waiting to hear it for 3 weeks without letting myself admit that's what I was doing. Sunday broke bright and unreasonable, the kind of clean, overlit morning that makes you feel like nothing bad could possibly happen in it, which is exactly the kind of morning you should learn to distrust. I'd promised Maddie I'd pick up a jacket she'd had altered at a shop 2 neighborhoods over. A small, ordinary errand, the kind you invent when your head needs somewhere to walk while it processes something it isn't ready to say out loud yet. Dante asked where I was going at breakfast. When I told him, he said he'd send Matteo. It's 10 minutes, Dante. I'll take my own car. An hour, he said. You're back within the hour. It wasn't a request, and for once I didn't argue the point, mostly because arguing with him always felt like arguing with weather. Technically possible, entirely pointless. I took the little sedan out through the side gate, past a new guard I didn't recognize yet, young, a little too eager with the radio clipped to his belt, still finding the rhythm of his own post. You wave. He didn't notice, or I didn't notice him noticing, the phone that came out of his pocket the second my car cleared the corner. The shop was 3 neighborhoods over, past the busier avenue and into the quieter grid of streets where Sunday mornings actually behaved like Sunday mornings. I found a parking spot directly in front of the shop, the kind of open spot that on any other day would have been claimed within minutes, and some part of me, some old stupid boarding house instinct, flagged it as strange even as I pulled in. I ignored the flag. My head was still on a leather sofa, on a hand trembling once against the back of my neck. Got out, locked the car, took 3 steps toward the door. The van came from the cross street, not fast, not obvious, until it wasn't, until it swung into the curb at an angle that blocked the sidewalk entirely, and the side door slid open before the vehicle had even fully stopped. 2 men, hooded. A gloved hand clamped over my mouth before I could get a sound out. I fought. I got a heel into someone's shin hard enough to hear a grunt in Italian, sank my teeth into the hand at my mouth and tasted leather and blood. None of it mattered. They lifted me like I weighed nothing, and the van door slammed before my knees hit the floor, and a hood came down over my head with a speed that told me, with total clarity, that these were men who had done this before, more than once, without needing to think about the choreography of it. Andiamo, someone said up front, and the van pulled away. A hand pressed my head to the floor. A voice close to my ear accented and unbothered. Quiet, little one. You're a guest of Rossetti. You'll be treated well enough for now. I counted turns until I lost count on the fourth. I thought of Dante's face at breakfast, saying an hour, and the sick certainty settling into my stomach that I wasn't going to make it back inside that hour, or maybe at all. The hood smelled like motor oil and someone else's fear. That was the first thing I understood when the van finally stopped, before the sound of a rolling steel door, before the rough hand pulling me out onto wet concrete. I stumbled to my knees. Somebody laughed. They took the hood off in a warehouse with a ceiling 3 stories high, the air thick with rust and lake water, containers stacked at the far end, gulls somewhere outside screaming at nothing. Men. 3 armed. A 4th in a pale gray jacket who turned toward the light, and I recognized him with a cold drop in my stomach. The man from the park, the one who'd watched Bianca on the swings a beat too long. Salvatore Rossetti. I didn't know the name yet. I knew the type on sight. They tied me to a metal chair, wrists behind my back, the knots professional enough that fighting them only made them tighter. I learned quickly to stop fighting. Do you know who I am? He asked, hands in his pockets, a smile that had clearly been practiced somewhere with a mirror. You didn't offer me coffee, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to. He actually laughed. A real one, delighted with himself. Marchetti has good taste this time. I expected some Eastern European model. They told me it was the Nanny. The Nanny has a name. I know your name, Nora. I know which building you live in. I know your friend Maddie tends bar for a manager who wouldn't lift a finger if this whole city burned around him. He stepped closer, cologne sharp under the warehouse rust. Don't mistake this for a conversation between equals. You're here as a courtesy call. Gave him nothing. It was the only leverage I had left, and I intended to spend it slowly. I counted the days in meals, a bottle of water at dawn, stale bread at night, and lost count somewhere between the second and third dark. No one hit me. No one needed to. It was the silence between visits that did the real work, the cold concrete under my legs, the water that never stopped moving somewhere out beyond the walls, the not knowing whether it was morning or midnight that ate at me slower and more thoroughly than any single act of violence could have. Rossetti came back periodically, folding himself into a chair across from me like a man visiting a sick relative out of obligation. You think he's coming? He said once, almost gently. I think so. Marchetti didn't come for his own wife. Did you know that? She collapsed in that house alone, and by the time he landed from Milan, she'd already been gone for hours. He tilted his head, watching my face for the crack he was fishing for. This is a man who loves his work, Nora, not people. I thought of a photograph face down on a coffee table. I thought of a hand trembling once, just once, against the back of my neck. I said nothing, but my face must have betrayed something, because Rossetti's smile widened, satisfied as a cat with something small and still breathing under its paw. Ah, he said softly. It's worse than I thought. He left. The lights went out. And it was there, alone in the dark with the sound of water against the hull outside, that I cried for the first time. Not from fear of dying, but because Rossetti had found, with surgical precision, the exact place it hurt most. The possibility that Dante might not come at all. I caught myself whispering into the dark, quiet as a held breath. Come find me. Dante's account of those 70 hours, told to me much later in pieces, on nights he couldn't sleep. Matteo's call came 3 hours after lunch. Her car is parked 2 blocks from the shop. Driver's door open. Her purse still on the seat. He remembered setting the phone down carefully, like breaking it would make the news less true. He remembered opening his desk drawer and checking a magazine he wasn't aware of loading. He remembered Tomas, his consigliere 55 years old, the only man in that house who'd ever seen him bury a wife and knew exactly what that same look meant a second time, coming in without knocking, already aware, already moving to stand between Dante and the door. Sit down, Dante. He didn't sit, but he put the gun away. It was Rossetti, Matteo said. The new gate guard's been feeding him information for a month. We're already tracking 3 compatible warehouses along the river. How long to confirm? 12 hours, maybe less. 6, Dante said. You have 6. For 70 hours he didn't eat, didn't change his shirt, didn't sleep more than the 20 accidental minutes his body forced on him twice. Bianca asked for me 3 times a day. And 3 times a day he told her I was away helping a friend, hating the lie a little more each time he repeated it. Mrs. Alvarez set plates in front of him that came back untouched, and said nothing about it, because some things a person simply endures alongside you in silence. They found the warehouse in the dark hours before Wednesday dawn. An old terminal building, Rossetti's shipping containers stacked like a curtain out front, 15 men estimated inside. Rossetti himself asleep 3 blocks away in an apartment like a man who trusted his own reputation a little too much. They went in at 4 in the morning. Dante went first. Tomas tried to stop him. Matteo didn't bother trying because Matteo knew, after enough years at his side, exactly which nights a man could not be stopped. What happened inside those walls isn't mine to narrate in detail. Some things you live through and then fold away and bury on purpose, and I've never asked Dante for more than the shape of it. What I remember is the beam at the back of the warehouse, and turning my head at the sound of a door giving way, and seeing him, Dante, stepping over something on the floor without looking down at it, moving toward me like the rest of the building simply didn't exist. Nora, he said. I lifted my head. Took a moment for my eyes to focus. When they did, I managed something close to a smile because some part of me had apparently decided that if I was going to survive this, I was going to do it with a little dignity intact. You took your time, I said. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, cut the ropes with hands that weren't entirely steady, and pulled his jacket off his own shoulders to wrap around mine before I could even ask. I shook when the fabric touched me, the warmth of it almost painful after so many hours of cold. Can you walk? I can, Dante. I swear I can. Understood. I staggered. He caught me at the waist and I let him, and for one long second I put my forehead against his shoulder and breathed him in, cedar gun oil, something underneath both that was simply exhaustion and relief in equal measure, and felt something in my chest that had been in pieces for 70 hours click back into place all at once, painfully, gratefully. I'm not losing you, he said low, in the voice I'd learned was the one he used only when what he was saying functioned as law in his own head. Not you. Do you understand me? Whoever touches you again disappears from this city. Okay, I whispered. Okay. He kissed my forehead, and there wasn't anything else to say. The car ride home passed in silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. I sat wrapped in his jacket with his hand around mine, Matteo driving, Tomas up front giving us the courtesy of looking anywhere but the rearview mirror. I looked at Dante's profile against the window. 3 days of beard, eyes red-rimmed, a dark stain on his cuff I decided, deliberately, not to ask about. And I thought of Rossetti's voice in that warehouse, trying to plant something poisonous in me. This man loves his work, not people. He was wrong. This man had crossed 70 hours and God knew how many locked doors to pull me out of a metal chair on a concrete floor. This man was sitting beside me now, holding my hand like letting go wasn't a possibility his body would allow. I stopped denying, somewhere on that quiet drive home, what I'd been denying since the night of the storm, maybe since the narrow gallery hallway, the first time he looked at me like I was a person and not furniture. I loved him. I'd loved him for weeks and refused, out of some old survival instinct, to call it by its name. The gates opened like the house had been waiting the whole 70 hours for exactly this. Mrs. Alvarez stood at the front steps with both hands pressed over her mouth, and behind her, barefoot in a nightgown with Ember dragging by one ear, stood Bianca. She looked at me. She looked at her father. She took off running, down the steps, across the wet gravel, the particular full-body run of a child whose entire world has just become bearable again. He knelt. Dante knelt beside me, and she threw one arm around each of our necks at once, burying her face between us, crying quietly. The kind of crying that comes from a child who hasn't let herself cry in far too long and has finally been given permission. You came back, she said into my hair. Daddy said you would. Daddy doesn't lie. I looked at Dante over her small shoulder. There was nothing contained about his face in that moment. No armor left in it at all, just a man kneeling in wet gravel with his daughter on one side and me on the other, eyes bright in a way I never expected to see from him. Mrs. Alvarez sniffled loudly behind us and claimed, unconvincingly, that dust had gotten into her eyes. Mateo studied the sky like dawn had suddenly become the most fascinating thing in Illinois. And I knelt there in a dead man's jacket that had somehow become mine, with a little girl's arms around my neck and her father's hand finding mine over her back, and understood, for the first time in longer than I could remember, that I wasn't going anywhere. The garden the next morning was washed clean. Drizzle finally stopped, sun coming through the old oak in uneven stripes across the wet stone bench. My wrists still ached where the rope had marked them, a bruise gone the color of a storm cloud. Dante found me there with 2 cups of coffee, and sat close enough that our shoulders touched, and for a while neither of us said anything, because some silences don't need filling, they need only to be survived together. "I spent 4 years," he said finally, turning his cup slowly between 2 fingers, convinced there wasn't room left in me for anyone, that I'd buried what was good along with her. Pause, longer than the last. "Then you walked in wearing shoes not made for that gravel, looking like you wanted to run before you even got past the gate. And I ignored you for weeks because it felt safer than the alternative. It wasn't. It was never safer." He looked at me directly, no folder in his hands, no distance left between us at all. "I can't imagine this house without you in it anymore. Not the house. Me. I can't imagine myself without you in it. I know what staying means, what it costs to build a life next to a man like me. I'm asking anyway, not as a Marchetti, just as Dante." I thought of every careful, sensible sentence I could have offered instead, the kind that protects the person saying them. What came out was simpler than any of them. "I have nowhere else I'd rather be, Dante. And even if I did, I wouldn't go." His hand found mine on the cold stone, and this time when it closed over it, it wasn't caution. It was an anchor. That evening, for the first time, Bianca fell asleep between us on the couch during a movie neither of us finished watching, and neither of us moved her. Some fragile, ordinary peace had finally arrived in that house, the kind neither of us said out loud for fear of frightening it off. I thought I'd finally been given everything. Bianca calling me down for breakfast before I was even fully awake. Dante's hand finding mine under the table without either of us thinking about it anymore. A family I'd sworn, quietly, privately, to protect with everything I had left to give. Then Bianca collapsed in the upstairs hallway 3 days ago, and the doctors used words like rare and genetic and we need family history, and Dante went very still in a way I hadn't seen since the warehouse. That night, going through an old box for her mother's medical records, I found a folder that had clearly never been meant for me. Adoption papers. A different last name crossed out. A private clinic in Milan, dated 4 years before Bianca was born. Dante doesn't know I found it yet. I don't know how to tell him that the daughter he spent 4 years grieving a version of might not be who either of them believes she is, or what that means for the medicine she needs, or for the man I love, who has already lost one version of his family once, and doesn't yet know he's about to be asked to lose the story of it all over again. I don't know if I'll still have the courage to hand him that folder when the sun comes up.